everyone, and welcome back to God in Our City, your parish podcast. We're back. My name is Edmund Mitchell, Director of Evangelization and Catechesis. Maybe we'll just drop the catechesis, because evangelization, right? Like, that involves catechesis.
Yeah, that's true.
It's a long title. I feel insecure every time I say it.
Oh, and I think a long title makes you more important.
Then I should make my title longer.
Just keep adding things.
How long is your title? Laura Nelson, who is on this podcast
Laura
with me.
Nelson, Coordinator of Children's Catechesis. It's kind of short.
Okay.
Sorry.
Right.
Yeah. I'm kind of feeling inadequate
now. We'll add more.
Children's Catechesis.
Children's evangelization and catechesis and mission.
Yes. And I don't know. I'll think of some other things.
Well, thanks for being back here. Thanks, everyone, for tuning back in for another episode. Today, we're talking about 3 spiritual journeys. But before we get to that, we wanted to set it up a little bit. We wanted to talk about why is it that some people find themselves very engaged in their faith, and there's so many different, and some people not so engaged. There's so many different, if you imagine in your life or in your experience, so many different levels of engagement, quote unquote, in the faith. And so we wanted to maybe highlight some of those experiences, or maybe just think of people that have had different experiences of their faith.
Well, I think maybe a misconception to address is there's not one spiritual journey, right? There's many, but it's not just a to God, away from God. Yeah. That's not the two journeys. There's 3 journeys that have been identified, and they encompass 3 aspects of our spiritual life. And they come together to paint a complete picture of where we are, right?
Maybe another good way to put this is like how you answer the question, or how someone might answer the question when you ask them, so are you religious or spiritual? And some people would say,
some people say I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. Yeah.
Or someone might say, yeah, I'm Catholic. And then the follow-up question would be, well, tell me about that. What, like
where do you go? Where do you go
what
to
makes
mass?
you Catholic?
You're like, oh, I really don't go to mass, or I go to daily mass.
Or I'm very involved.
Yeah,
I'm really involved in my Catholic
I'm in charge of this. This kind of things. Yeah, it is. It's very different how we answer that, and I don't know if that's true for our Protestant brothers and sisters. If they answer that question about their faith differently than we as Catholics. I think there is a Catholic culture that has evolved over the many years, at least in the United States. I can't speak for the rest of the world, but that is very much linked to the practice of the faith, the outward practice, the things that other people see. And I think there's more to that than we as cradle Catholics sometimes allow for.
Yeah, and we're going to be referencing this book a ton. So if you haven't bought it already, For Me Intentional Disciples.
We should just get a link on Amazon, like affiliate link or something. Totally. Make money for your parish.
We have lots of copies of this book up at the parish, so please come ask me for it. But in the book, For Me Intentional Disciples, Sherry Weddell really sets up the statistics of the church in America, or the church in the world, but just the statistics of how people are drifting away from God and the church, and that it isn't often just because of a controversial teaching or scandal in the church. It's often that people just kind of gradually drift away.
Right.
And one of the fastest growing religions, quote unquote, or religious affiliations in America is the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, people who just say, I'm not anything. And what do we learn from all of that? And she sets up this idea that is supported by church teaching, and really this rediscovering of the importance of evangelization in the church. She sets up this idea of the lack of a personal relationship with God, a lack of
which sounds super Protestant
to
people who are raised Catholic.
Totally does, yeah.
It sounds like uncomfortable for a lot of people.
Really uncomfortable. And she sets up, especially, I think it's in whatever chapter this is, I think it's chapter 3 or 4, but she sets up like oftentimes when people are talking about their Catholic quote unquote identity,
right?
It's this kind of like, I just imagine
it's like Catholic resume.
Yeah, and I imagine I also imagine like during the time in America where like New York, I'm just imagining like an Irish Catholic church, and then like the Italian Catholic church, like in the 20s or the 1920s or something. And there's just like, what was your identity? Were you Jewish or Catholic or Protestant?
Were you Italian Catholic, an Irish Catholic, a Polish Catholic?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so we still kind of have that, I think, in America, this kind of like, it's just an identity, as opposed to oftentimes our Protestant brothers and sisters are much better in the way they talk about being Christian as not just an identity, but a life-changing way of life.
Right. It's very intimate for them.
Yeah.
And I find even with myself that, and what I do and what I know, that I find myself referring to like my family of origins, Catholic history, their Catholic resume as part of my Catholic resume. Like, I have 2 aunts that were nuns, and I have uncle who's a priest, or those kind of things, as if see, this paints a whole picture of who I am. Really has nothing to do with my interior life at all. It has something to do with my background and how I was raised. But
this also reminds me of in the book Introduction to Christianity, Pope Benedict talks about how our Catholic creed starts with "I believe,"
right,
and how that was really different from the Old Testament. It was a major shift from an Old Testament worldview, which was much more concerned with behavior. Like in the Old Testament, there was a lot of God was showing lots of laws,
right?
And
we uphold the law,
like follow all the rules in Leviticus and follow the 10 Commandments. And
it was also much more about the nation of Israel, right, and not the individuals within the nation.
Yeah, and so when the creed is formulated and it starts with this "I believe" statement, that implies a much deeper change. It's much deeper than identity. I behave a certain way, or I belong to a certain church. It's I believe. We say that at Mass, and that implies something much deeper. And Sherry Weddell in this book, Forming Intentional Disciples, like you said, Laura, like there isn't one spiritual journey. There really are 3 spiritual journeys that you could be in any. You
could call it the Holy Trinity of spiritual journeys. I mean, that number 3 keeps coming up. I'm just going to say.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So she says this: Catholicism or intentional discipleship involves these 3 concurrent spiritual journeys. In practice, they're often treated as separate. But what that means is like you could progress or digress in any of these throughout. It doesn't mean that you go from one to the next. It's just that these are 3 areas of
it's
our
not
life.
Tag team or relay race or anything.
So here are the 3 that she defines. The first one is the personal interior journey of a lived relationship with Christ resulting in intentional discipleship. The second is the ecclesial journey, meaning the journey in the church through the reception of sacraments of initiation, so baptism, confirmation, the Eucharist.
And that's the journey that most Catholics refer to when they're talking about, like, are you Catholic? I was baptized, I had my first communion, and I got confirmed at this date, and I've been married in the church, or,
If you have a neighbor and you're like, hey, tell me about yourself, and then, they say, we go to church, and you say, where? And they say, oh, I'm Catholic. And, they might say, well, yeah, when I married my wife, I became Catholic. Right. And what they mean is this journey, the sacraments. They received the sacraments and came in.
They were initiated into the sacraments of the church.
And then there's the journey of active practice, as evidenced by receiving the sacraments, attending Mass, participating in the life and mission of Christian community. So I love that she differentiates between these 3 things, because when we make this kind of differentiation, we can talk more clearly about what do we mean when we say evangelization? What do we mean when we talk about a relationship with God? There are these 3 areas that we can kind of highlight and compare and contrast.
And they can come in any order. That's the thing, is you can have a deeply intimate relationship with Christ before you've gone through your ecclesial journey. And you can have gone through the ecclesial journey without the intimate relationship with Christ, or without being in practice of the church, in the daily Catholic to-dos or Christian to-dos, the life of the faithful. So, there was a recent God in Our City episode about the 44, and the 44 could be in journey number 3. I mean, they're coming to Mass, but they're not Catholic, or they consider themselves they don't consider themselves Catholic anymore, but they were baptized in the faith. So they are on a journey as well. They're just not on the ecclesial journey. And
there's been situations where people have been very active. So that journey, the journey of active practice, maybe they aren't receiving the sacraments, but they're very active in our church.
Oh yeah, I know of a couple of people who are spouses of Catholics who are more active at our parish than are people who are Catholic. I mean, they're like running ministries and doing all these things, volunteering and doing all this wonderful thing, very giving people and very connected to the community, but they've never become members of the Catholic Church. It's very interesting.
And what's really helpful as a parish, and as, you're listening to this, consider yourself a leader at our parish and want to get involved in the parish and in evangelization.
And can I just say, if you're when he says a leader, that doesn't mean that you're in charge of a ministry necessarily.
No.
The fact that you are drawn to this podcast and what we're trying to talk about shows that you're a leader in faith. And that hopefully you're a member of our parish.
And maybe you feel like you're a leader of your family household. Like maybe you feel like you're a leader of faith in your co-working environment
or you want to be more of a leader in those environments.
So
it's very true.
Thank you for saying that. Yeah. If we want to call out to people and like try to empower more leaders to step forward in our parish. But as leaders in our parish, lots of parishes, not all parishes, but it is often the case that parish leadership forget that people can be very active and not have a relationship with God, have any of that interior journey or the sacraments. And so oftentimes parishes in the past especially have assumed, not just our parish, a lot of parishes in America, they assume the interior journey has occurred. And they assume that people coming would only be coming if they already have that interior journey. Yeah.
It's kind of like when you go to a specialist, like a medical doctor who's a specialist in one area, and let's say you go to a surgeon and you're like, I've got this pain in my shoulder, and they're like, oh, we must do surgery to do that. And you're like, okay, great. And then you go to an a chiropractor, and he's like, oh no, you're just out of joint, right? So it's that we sometimes specialize so much that we don't see the holistic, right? How the parts all work together. And we think that one part is the whole, right? We're looking at the forest at one tree and thinking that is the forest. Sometimes we look at the ecclesial journey as if it's the whole forest when it's really not, right?
And this is a natural, obviously, we could have done this better as a church, and the church fathers, the recent popes have kind of called for this resurgence of evangelization because we're dealing with a unique time, but it's not really unique for us. This
Augustine went through the same time.
This is natural, especially when in the time of Constantine, when Christianity became legal. Right. Now you're not dealing with whether or not you're going to get killed. Now you're just dealing with, in some ways, a more dangerous battle, which is apathy, right? Which is that you could externally look like a Christian, but internally it's because
there's no risk, there's no harm, no foul. Might as well be, but your heart's not there, right?
So it's interesting as we talk about this. Many people might be wondering, like, well, okay, you're talking about this personal interior journey. There's the ecclesial journey and the journey of active practice. What do we mean by a personal interior journey of a lived relationship with Christ, and why is that so important? What would you say to someone who says, like, I don't know, that sounds Protestant. Why is that so important? Like, they need to go through, they need to get the sacraments, and they need to be involved at the church and come to Mass. Right. What is this like? How do we even talk about someone's personal relationship with God?
Because it's personal, right? It's like that's
between them and God.
Right. It sounds very intrusive, but what I would say is the whole goal of the ecclesial journey and the practice of the faith is to have an intimate relationship with God, right? With Jesus. And to discount that, that's something that I'm a cradle Catholic, and the idea of a personal relationship with Jesus is something that I have come to be aware of in my adulthood, for sure. Now I've been an adult for a while, so that's been in my on my radar for a while. But at the same time, it's it can be a foreign concept. But when we forget that God desires an intimate relationship with us, it makes the rest of the journey meaningless, right? It makes it, like I said, it's not a holistic view. It's just the physical, right? Yeah. It's just the outward appearance. And, granted, we live in the Instagram world where outward appearance doesn't mean a lot, but in the long run, it doesn't fill that God-shaped hole in your soul, right? We have to remember, and if I'm going to backtrack, if you don't know this, I want to invite you to understand that God isn't a God of the masses. God is your God. And he loves and desires a relationship with you as an individual. He created you for a purpose, and that purpose is that individual relationship. So when you forget that or aren't aware of it in the first place, you do think that going through the motions might get you there, wherever there is, maybe heaven or just to be in harmony or in community with other people who are like-minded. But the ultimate goal is union with Christ. And ultimately we won't get there until we're in heaven completely, right? So, or we won't completely get there, but there is union with him on this side of the veil, right? It's just different. And it's hard to see, right? It's not something not something you see. It's something that is hard to reveal. I mean, it makes you very vulnerable.
Very personal. Yeah. And I think in Catholic circles in the past, we've been less comfortable with those types of conversations. And I think you're exactly right. People often, when we start talking about this, they're like, well, this sounds really either Protestant or emotional.
Right.
Like, oh, this sounds like touchy-feely. What are you talking about?
Right. And let's be rational.
Yeah. And the phrase personal relationship with Jesus is just a way to talk about something, a word that we use all the time that gets misunderstood, a very old word that is in all Catholic theology and the church teaching and the sacraments and everything. And that word is faith. And oftentimes we think by faith, just like, and I know growing up, I just thought faith was just blind belief that everything will be okay.
Right.
But faith,
it's like hope.
But faith is the personal adherence of our intellect and our will, the whole of our person, to a God who's worth trusting. And that's very different than having faith in the Republican Party or faith in the Democrat Party or faith in conservatism or relativism or any type of idea.
Right. Any ism.
Yeah, it implies a person. And so like I am faithful to my wife, or I have faith in my wife, not because she's an idea, but because she's a person. And there's a personal relationship between me and my wife. And the same is, we're called to that same level of involvement in our faith. It's not just a set of ideas, Pope Benedict, that famous quote.
You didn't have faith in your theoretical wife before you met her because you didn't know her.
It's that famous Pope Benedict quote that we say way too much, but Christianity is not the result of an ethical idea or a lofty idea or a philosophical system. It's an encounter with a person who has a face and a name. So that's really important.
Well, if you go back to the early church and the apostles, the thing that changed their life was meeting Jesus and encountering him intimately. And then the thing that spread the gospel was intimate encounter with these people who had the intimate encounter with Jesus. And it was this intimacy that was contagious and spread, right? Yeah. That's the thing that spread the gospel and made Christianity a worldwide phenomenon, right? It wasn't just like, hey, there's this cool idea, let's be nice to people and let's put others before ourselves. And those are all good ideas and they're lofty, but they don't propel this kind of perpetuation of a relationship. It's really a relationship.
And Sherry talks about in this book that journey, the journey of the interior journey, we're much more comfortable as Catholics talking about the ecclesial journey and the journey of active practice. But she describes this
tangibles.
She describes this kind of cone of silence around the personal interior journey that as Catholics we're much less comfortable. So we often adopt this don't ask, don't tell kind of thing.
Right.
Like, well, that's just between him and God. Like, who am I to ask that question? We're not comfortable asking that. But that leads to this secondary problem, which is then we start believing wrongly that type of relationship is optional and it's just for really holy people.
Right.
Because
don't get me started on this.
Yeah, because no one's talking about it. You don't see anyone showing an example of it. And maybe when you start hearing about it, it sounds like a saint, or you're reading a book and you're like, wow, this person must have been so holy. That's why they had that relationship with God. And those are two things that are very damaging to the gospel message. That idea that don't ask, don't tell about this. That's very
it's
personal.
Elitism in our faith, and that's not the way God made us, right? That's not what he made us for or how he made us. And, you know this about me. I'm very passionate about the universal call to holiness. And for those who aren't familiar with that phrase, that just means that all of us are called to be holy. It's not an elite few, right? And I was struck by this as I came to understand what holiness truly is. And it really is not about perfection. It's not about, stagnant statues that, are immobile, that have, no facial expressions and can't, don't twitch during prayer time or, let their minds wander. It's about real people who continue to try to strive to have a relationship with God, even when things go badly and when they screw up, right? Yeah. So we all have that capacity. The question is, do we have that desire?
Yeah.
Right? Because if we have the desire for holiness, God will help us along the way, right? So this is a huge thing for me but I think one of the reasons why it's such an uncomfortable topic is because that interior life is where all the insecurities, all of our anxieties and fears, the things that we are thinking that we're just not doing this right, we're not up to snuff, God isn't speaking to me the way he speaks to you, the comparative kind of thing, that's where it all comes through, is that interior life. And that's where the doubts are. And those are the things, it's almost like reconciliation. You don't want to, there's a reason why there's a seal to the confessional, right? People are like, this is just between me and God, and this is not for public knowledge. So it's uncomfortable, right? You feel very vulnerable. But I'm not saying we have public confessions because that's not the way to go. But we do need to show others that vulnerability, partly to give them hope, right? To see that it's not just about being perfect, right? It's about the struggle. The struggle is real, and it's okay.
Yeah.
And anyway, sorry.
That's great. I think this really, for me, is so enlightening for the way we approach a lot of stuff in the church. I think for so long, I really thought that a lot of it, and maybe other people can relate to this, I really thought a lot of it just came down to apologetics or how to defend the faith.
Right, which is all very rational.
Yeah, and if only we could put all the defenses for the faith out in the public sphere and everyone could see it, then they'd all become Catholic.
Right.
But it turns out that, why is it that people can go through the ecclesial journey, be baptized and then confirmed, and then when they're 17, just stop going to church altogether.
Right.
And people think it's because, they intellectually need to understand more. And I think really it's kind of the flaw of the Enlightenment movement, that is like, we can just rationalize everything away.
And faith and reason together are really important. Yeah. We don't want to discount that.
But when we don't talk about that personal relationship, if we don't stir up personal response of faith, then they're just left with a textbook,
and which is very sanitized. That's a very antiseptic way to relate to your faith, that it's an intellectual endeavor. It's something you might do with your physical body, go to mass, say these prayers, do these things, serve these people, but there's a wall that you have there in your heart that's not letting Jesus in. That's the reality.
And it really makes sense, why the early church was just so effective at evangelizing, because they didn't have, in the Acts of the Apostles, they didn't have St. Thomas Aquinas's Summa. They didn't have they didn't have CatholicAnswers.com.
Right,
you know what I mean? They only had the witness of their lives, actions for sure. They had the witness of their active practice, right? Christians were the first people, out on the front lines, like serving the poor and the sick. But they also just had all they had was the witness of this person who you killed, or this person who was killed, rose from the dead, and I have a relationship with him that has changed everything.
Right.
And that is something that's really effective. And so, honestly, for me, I was like, man, I don't have to know everything. I just have to let Jesus Christ and my relationship with him transform my life.
Yeah.
And that witness alone is so hard to argue with.
Yeah. It's funny. I was kind of giggling because I remember years ago someone trying to get me into a multi-level marketing sales situation and was saying to me, you don't need to do anything different than you're already doing. Like, if you go to a great restaurant, you're going to tell everybody about this restaurant, and they should probably be giving you, a payback or whatever, like discounts, because you're doing such a good job telling people about what you love, right? Yeah. That's what evangelization is telling people about who you love. Yeah. And that's the thing but it has to come from a place of love, and you have to know him to love him, right? So, the ecclesial journey is amazing. And if it's done well and with your whole body and soul, then you can come to know Christ better through the ecclesial journey and through the practice of the faith. But you can't pretend that two of those journeys equate the third,
exactly,
or result in the third, always.
So some practical takeaways of this, and again, I'm glad, Laura, that you brought this up to just remind people, we're trying to inspire leaders in our parish to become like, to really own that they're a leader in our parish. There can't be anyone on the sidelines. There can't, if we're going to really embrace the call to make missionary disciples, to answer the Great Commission, to evangelize, I mean, people need Jesus. And we are, I mean, in some ways you could say there are other churches in Grapevine. We're the only Catholic church in Grapevine.
Yeah, we're the best Catholic church in Grapevine.
We're the best Catholic church in Grapevine. So like, it's like we were planted here, you are planted, if you're listening to this, wherever you were planted, you're part of this community. And so that means that you are kind of tasked with the mission of evangelization, to bring Jesus to other people, or to bring Jesus to the people in your family.
You are the church.
Yeah, to bring Jesus to the people in your family. So we want to call forward people to take up that call, and then you're a leader, right? Like at that point, then we're considering you a leader.
If you care, you're a leader.
Yeah.
Right?
And so we want to empower leaders to help us change a culture in our community, in our city, in our parish. And so that starts with this, with trying to say no to that cone of silence, to that don't ask, don't tell.
Right.
And to change a culture, it really takes all of us leaning into it and having those conversations. So something Sherry Weddell encourages is just to ask people, can you tell me about your relationship with God to this point in your life? Yeah. And to be really gentle when asking it. And if someone in your mind, knowing that if someone says, well, I was confirmed in 1984, to say, thank you for sharing. You don't have to say your ecclesial journey, but say, wow, thank you for sharing that.
That's awesome.
What else? Tell me more about your relationship with Jesus. And if they say, well, I'm involved. I'm a Eucharistic minister, and I teach Sunday school for Laura. Wow, thank you for sharing that.
That's awesome.
Could you also...
What else?
There's
more.
Can you tell me about... what about you, though? Like your relationship with God. Tell me about that. And that's uncomfortable, and people oftentimes don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And they might ask you to share yours,
Right.
So I think that's a challenge for leaders of our parish, to start pushing in that direction of... And just knowing these three things alone helped me so much in conversations. Not to make people feel defensive.
Right.
But
because each one of these journeys is good.
Very important.
Right. And important. It's not... We're not discounting the ecclesial journey, or what's the third one called? I always have a problem with it.
Active
practice. Okay, it doesn't have a catchy name as much, but there's nothing wrong with those. Those are vital parts of our faith, but we have to marry those three together into a holy trinity.
And if we're missing the personal interior journey conversation, we're really missing the power of the gospel message, So I would encourage people, think yourself, what has been my journey, my interior journey of personal relationship with God, and then try to very carefully with people in your life, try to go in that direction of the conversation. And it's difficult, it's going to be messy, but it's going to have, just that alone would have a huge impact on our church if we were having more conversations about that, because just asking the question oftentimes is enough for people to start having this hunger for that, and not even realize that they're missing that's even possible.
Well, and don't be discouraged if you ask those questions and people are like, I don't know, and they walk away because the seed has been planted, and they might come back to you and say, I've been thinking about what you just asked me a year ago, a month ago, a week ago. And this is what I think my answer is now.
A few years back, we started that with the core team, and I remember one night where we'd been talking about it for a long time, many meetings and months of core team for the youth ministry. And there was one night where all the core team just kind of said, stopped. And there was a few people that just said, can you guys tell us what your relationship with God has been like? What,
we need an example to know.
Because they just, a few people in particular just realized, I don't know that I have that. And just them admitting that out loud.
That's a breakthrough.
Was huge for them. It was huge for them. And they're like, I really want that. You know? Cool. So as we start wrapping up, Laura, I'll give you some time to think about your Grapevine shout out.
I already have one.
Oh, okay. What is it? What is it?
Oh, well, so my husband and I have been living in Grapevine for almost 21 years now. Yeah. So we've been we know some people around here. Jack at Concourse Automotive. Oh my gosh, he has kept our cars running for years. And I love Jack. He knows me. If you you mention my name, you're not going to get anything, but he'll say, hey, you know Laura, that's great.
Yeah.
But we've been taking our cars there for years, and he always does right by us. I mean, he's not the cheapest around the block or anything, but he always gives us good quality service,
That's
and
great.
he always tells us like the honest truth. You don't have to do this right now. You can wait on this, but you really should do this. Or if it was me, I would do that.
That's awesome.
You know, so I just trust Jack. He's awesome, and his family runs the business, and they've been in Grapevine for forever. So,
That's awesome. So
it's on Northwest Highway.
So you won't get a discount, but it would be so cool if you're listening to this and you go there.
Right.
Just be like, Laura Nelson sent us.
Yeah, right. Tell them like I was listening to a podcast and they mentioned your name. So
Yeah, that'd be great.
Awesome. Yeah.
That'd be great.
So Jack at Concourse.
I'll give my shout out to Michelle Gillitzer.
Oh.
Michelle Gillitzer is an amazing parishioner. She's super involved, a leader of our parish for sure.
Oh, yeah.
Leader in her family.
She's got a ton of energy, that
yes,
woman.
She has so much energy. Yeah, and just we're planning for the upcoming year and how do we make meaningful connection between parishioners. And Michelle's been really working hard behind the scenes, and we've been talking a lot about ways that we can just reach out to more parishioners and allow connection between more parishioners at our parish. So just
she's a great person for that job.
Yeah, she's
really
so good. Yeah, she's amazing. So shout out to Michelle.
Yeah, nice.
Cool. Well, thanks for joining us today.
It was
you
awesome.
can find God in Our City on Facebook, YouTube, and sfatx.org/
online.
That as well as I think God in Our City. So
Oh wow, we got so many.
I know we
so
got
many
too
places.
many.
No, it's not too
Go
many.
to our parish website. Thanks, guys.
Bye.